Good morning. We're starting up here in a couple of minutes, just letting people log in. One more minute, and we'll get ourselves started. Okay. So good morning. My name is David Orr. I'm the director at the New York State LTAP Center, the Cornell Local Roads Program. If you don't know who we are, we're part of Cornell Cooperative Extension. The LTAP Center is run through a grant with the State Department of Transportation, and we mainly work with transportation agencies, highway and DPWs, but we obviously have a lot of overlap with MPOs. And was asked to talk a little bit about liability issues, specifically on some of the MPO side of the house, transportation plans, things like that. So today we're going to have a little bit of fun, I hope, some interaction. We're going to be using a tool called PolEV. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. To get some interaction from you, who actually are the experts in some of these things we're going to talk about. So we'll get started and hopefully everybody will pick something up. Now, in terms of using Zoom, I know we've all used it a lot. Just as a reminder, your audio settings are at the bottom. The chat pod is turned off for you to put information in, but please open the chat pod up because that's where we're going to put links to some of our manuals that you might want to look at and download later on. We may ask you to raise your hand, okay? And the Q&A is definitely open. That's where I want to get some feedback. And if you can't access the polls via PolEV, you're more than welcome to put them in the Q&A and I can read them off and look at them there. I've got Amanda, Link, and Jody, Angelo in the background, or Angelo in the background. I was reading somebody's name. Sorry, Jody. And they're going to make sure I'm hands-free sometimes if I need to be. Now, as a caveat, we're talking about legal liability. I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV. So what I'm going to tell you today is what I've picked up over my quarter century here at Cornell, and prior to that, 8 years working for a county highway department, where essentially a lot of this is liability stuff. 90% of the time what I'm going to tell you is perfect, but there's always going to be those specific cases where you're going to want to talk to some legal counsel. So if you're not sure, go get some help. There's actually plenty of it out there, but just want you to keep that in mind. Really, we're just talking about perspectives on the liability situation. Now, in terms of welcome, just as we'll get started with a few simple questions. There's some of our basic ones we always ask, so they'll help me figure out who's actually on the call today. And again, we're going to be using a tool called Poll Everywhere. So go to www.polev.com/DavidOrPE. And if you've opened up the chat pod, it's there and it'll pop back up here just to remind you. or you could download the app if you prefer. I actually have it on my phone. It's actually sort of a cool little app, and we can have a little bit of fun with some things. Now, most of these materials we're going to use today come from one of our workbooks. We have lots of workbooks. We do training all over the state. We have classes on the powers and duties of highway officials and an older version of a legal liability class. We're redoing it completely from the ground up. So there is a new workshop and a new workbook. That particular one may, be not available now, but it will be soon. And you're welcome to go to the liability workshop. We're going to be hosting it around the state this spring and the fall, and we'll keep tweaking and making it better. Now, it is aimed at highway officials, but there's an awful lot of good stuff there in terms of just general liability. Now, to help me out, again, I'd like your help. So if you open up Poll EV, you'll get a list of who you work for. And I know a lot of you work for MPOs, but I know there's some others that we're going to be coming in, so we may get some others. We actually have 10 folks who put in county, I see. I'm not sure I like the color choices. Sometimes they're not my favorites, but we'll go from there. You can always put them in, again, the Q&A. It's all anonymous. We don't record any of the actual items, unlike a class when we do it, we record it there, but not here. And we have at least one person who's honest and they're here for the weekend. Well, that's good to know. Okay. Okay, well, that helps me. We actually have about an even split of the majority being MPOs and counties, and then we have some city village, and I see someone who's put it in that's also with a town. Okay, that's good to know. Okay. What is your job? If someone asked you, what is your job? What would you say your job is? And actually, I just realized I forgot to clear it from yesterday, so I apologize. I'm going to clear the responses and make you put them back in. Okay, give me a sec. We put them back in, please. Okay. So if someone asked you, what is your job? What would you say? Would you say it's a highway official, engineer, a supervisor, an administrator, something else, something other? Okay, you're welcome to put none of the above. If you do that, put it in the Q&A for me what you think your title is. Okay, I know if you work for an MPO, you probably don't see your title on there. So yeah, I bet I'm going to see some planners show up. And sure enough, I see a few planners. Okay, that's not surprising. We're doing something with metropolitan planning organizations. That's not surprising in the slightest. Ooh, transportation analyst. Ooh, I like that one. Okay, so planners. Okay, cool. Cool, good to know. And that helps me actually a little bit to know that we've got some engineers, some planners, and then a mix of other people involved. And then I'm wondering if this one didn't clear as well, because we did a webinar on Tuesday. And I'm betting I didn't clear this one either. Yep, let me clear this one. And then, how long have you been in your current position? Less than a month, up to 20 plus years, just to get a sense of how much history people have. Okay, we got a real big variety. I like it. Actually, I like to see the variety. That actually is useful if you think about it from the standpoint of some of the answers we're going to get. Everything from less than a year up to people who've got 20 plus. Okay, cool. And then, of course, supposedly we got folks from all over the state, but let's just find out for sure. And again, I did this on Tuesday and didn't clear it last night. I cleared all the other ones, but I think we'll see. Where are you from? So click on the map. It's pretty cool. You can actually click right on the map where you're from. Okay, good. We do actually have folks all over the state. And of course, magic person in Lake Ontario disappeared. Okay, okay, good. That's good to see. Good variety. I like it. Okay, some urban, some rural, upstate, downstate, New York City. Okay. Now we are talking about liability. Obviously, a lot of the liability stuff starts with the law. Okay. And of course, one of my favorite things I love to read, if you've ever read Oliver Twist or seen the musical Oliver, there's the famous thing about Mr. Bumble and the fact that they had somebody they shouldn't have had and some stolen goods. And supposedly Mr. Bumble didn't know. And he said, it doesn't matter. In the eyes of the law, you're still guilty. And he said something about the law being a donkey. Yeah, that's it. So an idiot. The law is there, and we have to deal with that law. What it really comes down to is when we get issues with legal stuff, is there risk involved? Now, we did a liability webinar, general highway liability webinar a couple of weeks ago, And we talked about liability, and we talked a little bit about risk. Really what it comes down to is torts, not the tort like you see on the plate there, though that one does look pretty good, but a tort which is essentially a wrong committed by somebody that you're supposed to fix. You're obligated to fix it by the law. That's a requirement, okay? So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about that, specifically in the context of how metropolitan planning organizations and transportation plans get involved. And again, the caveat being, and I'm doing this from an engineering perspective, but a lot of these things still hold true. A bit, manage your high-risk locations. We'll talk a little bit about that, and the fact that it's actually is a good thing to look at proactively ahead of time. Inspections, signage. Yeah, there's things we all know and can think about. And we'll come back to this particular question towards the end, but the idea being there are things we can do. So let's go in and talk a little bit about this, okay? Now, to create liability, you actually have to have 4 things that happen. There has to be a requirement, a duty that is obligated upon the agency doing the work, or on a private entity even, but there has to be a duty, a requirement for that. And then someone has to show that there's a breach of that duty. You didn't follow through. You had a responsibility to keep the road safe, and you didn't do so by a failure to act, or even by a positive action that made things unsafe. There has to be a relationship between an incident that actually occurred and that breach of duty. A roadway that's in good shape, well designed, and somebody goes down it at 95 miles an hour texting on their phone, there's no relationship between the reason they crashed and the fact that the road was there. Just because it happens to be on the roadway is not a causation. There has to be a relationship. And of course, there actually has to be damages related to that event. And that actually surprisingly happens more than you think. Someone says, oh, I got hurt. And, they're like a soccer player in certain countries where, they're holding their face and they got kicked in the knee. They're not really hurt, okay? But they're trying to claim damages. There have to be actual damages. So those are the 4 things to create liability. So let's talk about that. Now, when we did the webinar in general stuff, I broke it down, my little tort, into 7 slices of the most critical thing, because it was foundational, this webinar. We were really looking at duties and records, trees, which are a major issue, especially in rural communities, but even urban ones. How do you deal with the right-of-way, especially in villages and towns where the right-of-ways are by use, drainage issues, notice, and then frankly, having a safety culture, creating that common sense approach to making things safer. So that's what we were looking at when we were looking at this webinar from general liability. But what I want to do is I want to do a specific focus, because here we're going to be looking at MPOs and transportation plans, and we still have those duties to deal with, okay, no matter what. But what I want to do is I want to say, well, let's look at some specific things that come from this tort, these basic things, how they relate to MPOs, and that's duties, records, notice, and qualified immunity. So let's look in these little areas in more detail, how they deal with liability, especially when it comes to transportation plans. Now, we're going to start with duties because, again, if there's not a duty, then there's no liability. So this is a list of the duties when people said it before. So I just want you to see what they had. Now I'm going to clear it. And I want you to put in your own thinking. If you think responsibilities of a highway and DPW, Public Works Department, what do you think are their responsibilities? What would you, if you were asked, what would you think that would be? What are the responsibilities of their duties? Maintenance, safety, dealing with design, regulations, keeping records, protecting the public, okay? Compliance. And we're getting, similar things, general overview, 10,000-foot elevations. But when you start getting down to it, if you really start thinking about it, we're looking at broad level answers right now. But departments of public works and highway departments and anything related to transportation really is going to get in much, much more specific items, okay? So if you start thinking about the kind of things that people actually have to do, get down to a more detailed level, you're going to get more things like this. mowing the roadside, plowing the snow, maintaining and repairing bridges and replacing them, dealing with stop signs, specific things that have to be done, falling within those general categories of safety. And again, we could spend a whole bunch of time just talking about the duties when we get into specific lists. And we actually recommend any agency, including MPOs developing transportation plans, think about what are the responsibilities at a fairly tight level, sidewalks, intersections, crosswalks, signals, curbs, all those specific responsibilities and how they have to be maintained, while also thinking about the general safety issue that people have to deal with. When it comes to those responsibilities, one of the most important things to understand is there are some things that are what are called non-delegable. You cannot say, hey, I had a contractor do this, I'm not responsible. No, there's certain things you have to do. Just because you told somebody else to close the gate needs to be closed. If it's your responsibility, you're liable if that person doesn't do it. So if you hire a contractor, you're going to still be liable. So if an agency hires an MPO or works with an MPO to develop a transportation plan, the actual implementation of that plan falls back on the agency that's using the plan. Okay. Now, yes, there's some nuances with the way funding works and MPOs having certain responsibilities under certain laws. But again, you'll have to look at who's got the actual duty, who has the actual responsibility. And whoever has that cannot just pass it on. They have to understand that. So when you think about duties, also think about who is ultimately responsible. Remember Harry S. Truman and where does the buck stop? That's where we need to be thinking about developing our list of duties and responsibilities. The other thing I want to spend a little bit of time on is records. Okay. The one thing that usually winds up being a major issue in a lot of liability cases is a lack of records, or records that are there but incomplete. And that incompleteness leads to questioning whether or not something was actually done properly. Okay. So something to be aware of. Okay. Now, this is a simple question. This is what the answer was when we did the liability workshop. But now, let's just ask this again. That was 10 days ago. Let's try again. What was the weather 1 year ago today? Do I remember? Cold and cloudy. It's actually very cold. Much colder. The point is, it's really hard to know what the weather was without looking it up, without looking at a record. You can get your phone, you can ask your phone what the weather is. And of course, I'm looking at the weather in Ithaca, New York. It would be different in Long Island or upstate. So I'm looking at my weather here. The point is, we need to keep good records. Now, we recommend highway officials keep a daily log anytime they're out on the road, writing things down. But any work we're doing, we need to document it. Okay. So that's the key that you got to think about, is having good records. So yeah, one of the things we recommend absolutely is keeping a daily log if you're doing any kind of field work. Now, obviously, this doesn't affect the MPOs as much. You're not having to keep daily logs, but it is really important that you have really, really good records. Okay, that can be looked at and followed on later on. Okay. Maybe some old Chuck Berry or something would be good to have. But so what I want to do is I want you to tell me, okay, if I've got, this is the list of highway records. You can imagine a list of highway records. Now let's ask you the question, what do MPOs need to keep? What does a planning group need to keep? I'm going to clear this out. What are examples of records in your office if you're with a metropolitan planning organization, or if you're the city planner? What kind of things do you have in your office as a record? You've got your reports, you've got your studies, yep. And I see inspections and reports. You might have as-built plans that you're using that came from the Highway Department or the Department of Public Works. You've got minutes of meetings. You've got all those emails. There's big debates about whether that's a record or not. I'm not getting into that one today. Okay, you've got your financial stuff. Okay, your GIS and your mapping, yeah. You might have something that's statewide data like in CLEAR or ALICE, depending on which you're using, the old or the new system for crash and accident reports. Yep, you might have preliminary studies and engineering plans that were kept, photos, yeah. Similar data, but slightly different. And what happens is we take all of this information, okay, and we're going to turn around and we're going to create a transportation plan, okay? So we have transportation plans, and they're sort of like these clouds that were in the sky a few days ago. You know, you're looking at them ominously, and you're going, these plans are telling us we have to do something. So the question is, does that create liability? Oh, it's a good question. If you don't know what MPO stands for, it's Metropolitan Planning Organization. Essentially, there's MPOs in urban areas around the United States. And here in New York State, we have a whole bunch. I never remember the number off the top of my head. I have to look it up. That's why you keep records, okay? I do know that one of the smallest in the United States is where I am here in Ithaca, the Tompkins County Ithaca Transportation Group, which is the MPO here. And they are one of the smallest in the country, but if there's urban areas, there's certain changes in the rules and funding and all that, and that's just metropolitan planning stuff. But there's also, here in New York State, we have regional planning and development boards that are more rural. We have the Tuck Hill Commission. Anybody developing transportation plans falls into this strange area where does that increase or decrease your liability? And that's really what I want you to understand. And where does it fit within the whole process? So I'm going to ask you, you're the experts. You've been developing plans your whole career in some cases. Okay, so what I want to know is what is in your transportation plans? And one of the things they did with POLI-V, I'm not sure I like, is it default to this, and I can't get it to just default to the answers. But what is in your transportation plan? What kind of things, if I was to grab one of the plans off the shelf, open it up, what would I see? Okay, I would see a list of signs that might need to be put up. I'd see recommendations of improvements. I'd see all the data. Data might be as an appendix, but yeah, you'd see the data. A list of possible upcoming projects, maybe prioritized. Yeah, okay. What else might you see? Maybe some specifics. Give me a couple of real specific things that are in there, not just general recommendations. I mean, what does anybody have an example of something specific that they've actually put in and seen in a transportation plan, more than this general? Yeah, there we go. Sign and pavement marking study, where you're actually studying what roads need to have signs and pavement markings. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. It's over in the Q&A. A budget task table, so a listing of the tasks based on their budget. Yeah, okay. Ideas for improvement. But again, what level of granularity? An overall arching plan probably doesn't help you from a liability standpoint. It needs to be relatively specific, okay? And it turns out that relative specificity can actually help you, okay? Yeah, current road conditions, absolutely vital. Maybe from a safety standpoint, maybe from a just a management standpoint. We do a lot with asset management here. We have an asset management summer intern program. We primarily focus on pavements in that. But there, we definitely want to have an inventory of what's available. We want to have a condition rating and then a list of possible repairs. It's a transportation plan, okay? By the way, CMP, I will say CMP means different things to different people. I see CMP and I think corrugated metal pipe, but that's just me. The idea is you're going to get details in the plans, and they may be project level plans. They may be overall larger plans. They may list funding sources, things like that. There's all kind of stuff that can be in a transportation plan. Now, an example of a kind of plan that you might develop or might have seen is a local road safety plan. This happens to be a map from the Chemung County Local Road Safety Plan, and this happens to be a map focused on Elmira, and it lists the high-risk sections of roads and streets for roadway departures. These are the stretches where, when they looked at the risk factors, these segments had a higher than above, higher than average level of risk for roadway departures. And so the question that comes into mind is, wow, by writing that down, have I actually made Chemung County and the city of Elmira more likely to get sued, more liable to risk issues when it comes to, hey, if I just said nothing, I'd be okay. We'll talk about that. So keep that in mind. And we'll actually come back to this particular plan just as an example. But any plan, whether it's a local road safety plan, overall transportation improvement plan, a TIP or a STIP, we'll talk about these in general, but we'll just use this as an example from Chemung County. Okay. So now I wanted to spend a few minutes on notice. There's lots of debates and discussions about notice. And again, in our liability class, both the old one and the new one, we spend quite a bit of time talking about notice, but I just want you to understand what notice is. Notice comes in two flavors. There's written notice and there's actual notice, but then there's a lot of times when notice doesn't come up, okay? So let's talk about the difference. Written or actual notice is essentially when an agency has been put on notice in writing, usually through the clerk's office, or contacted by a police agency. A phone call from a police agency, the sheriff's office, counts as written/actual notice. Those written or actual notices are of a defect related to the maintenance and repair of a highway, a sidewalk, a building, something like that. They've been put on notice, okay? And then they have to respond with a reasonable plan of action, okay? So that's written notice. Those protections for highway and public works vary depending upon the level of agency. So for towns, they actually have to proactively, the board, the elected board, has to pass a local law to get those written notice protections here in New York State. Counties have a limited set of protections. They're really a very limited, some snowplow work and things like that. Counties can't get that protection generally as much as towns and villages. Well, we'll talk about cities in a sec. Villages, interestingly, have written notice protection built into state law. It's already there. I don't know why the difference is. That's somebody else's can get into the history of why, but villages already have complete written notice protection. So if somebody drove down the road and hit a pothole, well, guess what? They would be only liable if they didn't meet the requirements of written notice, somebody had notified them, or it falls under constructive notice. And let's make sure we understand that one too. Constructive notice is essentially the agency should have known. You know, at some point, you can't just say, well, nobody told us. And that's one of the reasons why I think transportation plans, people start thinking, well, if we don't have a plan, we're less liable. Well, yeah, but if you don't do regular inspections, then you actually can be more liable because now it's going to fall into constructive notice. Because you failed to do your job or your duty, there's actually a duty to do inspections, and you missed something that was obvious. It's been there for a long time. As an example, there was a case where the state, DOT, was sued because there was a pothole, and they claimed, well, we didn't have liability because we weren't told about the pothole. The pothole had been there for 5 months, at least, and it was in front of the driveway coming out of the state residency. There's no legal protection then. It's obvious they should have known about it. There's no way they can claim somehow everybody working for the state missed the pothole, so they lost the lawsuit. So if it's been there a long time, not having a plan actually makes your liability higher, okay? Now, when it comes to maintenance work and snowplow work and things like that, or even building things, if you build it, you're already in notice. So if you built a handicap crossing that has a 3/4 of an inch drop off, which is well above the ADA standard, you don't have any liability protection from notice. You're already on notice because you built it that way. So if you build it, you're stuck, okay? And somebody says in the Q&A, it's a really good point. If there's a deficiency in inspection or the final inspection on a project, yeah, there's no protection. That's again, you built it. If the inspection fails to catch something, you don't have protection of the notice. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, the reason for the written notice laws comes about because of court cases and some things within the law itself. And the idea comes around from a couple of lawsuits. Probably the most famous is Gorman and Huntington, and that is municipalities cannot be aware of every defect. And there is an opportunity then to fix the problem when you get written knowledge. And that's really the concept that's in play. That, look, these are vast systems. And a tree falls down, the pothole starts to form. It takes some reasonable amount of time to figure out those things have happened. And so you do have time to fix those physical defects or snow and ice defects. But remember, they're mainly based on maintenance issues, okay? Maintaining potholes, removing vegetation, things of that ilk. So just be careful about what's covered under notice categories. Not everything is covered, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a couple of minutes. I do want to make sure we talk about trees and vegetation, okay, quite a bit. There's an obligation by an agency to maintain and remove trees and vegetation that's creating a problem. That is non-delegable. It calls back to the municipality. Now, a lot of local agencies have ordinances that require the local homeowner remove things that are causing problems. They can do that, and they can actually then go in and try to sue that homeowner or landowner, but then it's going to come down to who has more liability, joint and severed liability, and then who gets sued, and all that. Everybody can get sued. But the point is, if you've set up laws that say, hey, the homeowner has to do the maintenance, you have to then enforce it, and you have to go back on them, and you may have to do the trimming and build them, because it just can't say, well, they didn't do it, so we're not liable. You still probably need to get that brush trimmed. You may sue them if it's something you couldn't have known about. But my advice to folks is have good plans in place. You're required to maintain any hazards that are in the right of way. The hanging tree, you need to take care of it, okay? And of course, we get into weird things with trees. If I got two trees, one tree is inside the right of way, that's to the left side of the dotted line, and one tree is on the right side. Who has responsibility? Who owns it? We can get into all kinds of crazy stuff with vegetation. And of course, that's assuming we know the right of way. We don't know the right of way, or it's a road by use or street by prescription. It gets even more complicated. My advice there again is having a plan actually helps you. Having procedures actually helps you. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the rest of this little webinar we're doing today. Now, again, there are a couple of exceptions. One of the biggest exceptions is known as the affirmative act or negligence exception. I've already mentioned that essentially, and that is if the municipality created the problem, then they've got a problem. If, for instance, somebody had in a transportation plan put in a poor design, they would be liable. They would be liable for any damages that occurred. This is an actual picture, okay? The road was paved with hot mix. It was double microsurfaced, and now the pothole forms, okay? So is that an affirmative action? Is that due to the paving, or is it due to something else, okay? The courts would make a final determination of that. If it was a slipperiness issue due to the asphalt and the rocks and all that, no doubt about it. That is an affirmative act. The agency is responsible. But if it's a water problem from underneath, would they reasonably have known there was a pothole that might have formed underneath? And again, the courts will have to decide that. But the key here is if you're doing things, document them, document what you did and why you did it. And good plans can actually help you here. So when you come across things like this, someone cut down a tree, but they left the stump, you're not going to get any protections there. So when you do actually do the work, when the plan says it's time to do the work, make sure you do it properly, okay? It could be a water valve that was adjusted, by the way, on the previous one. Yeah. That was my gut instinct, that they failed to put a proper cover and raise it up. And yeah, if that's true, probably are going to be liable. But that's the kind of thing, again, courts will make those determinations. Okay, so you have to be careful about these kind of things. Now, this is one that part of the reason why people get worried about these things is written notice laws do not apply to highway design claims. Okay, now we're not talking maintenance now. Remember, we're talking design, and transportation plans a lot of times deal with design. So now in this particular case, if you've designed something, you don't get those protections. Well, that actually makes sense, because essentially, if you built it, you don't get written notice protection. So if you've done something that creates an issue, well, you're not going to get that protection. So when you do a transportation plan, that could be an issue. And of course, here's a perfect example of something that, boy, I don't think that meets ADA. I don't know how you would use that if you were having a hard time getting up and down curbs. I mean, there's a nice curb cut here across this 4 lanes of road with a little barrier thing in the middle, but if you don't catch the light, better hope somebody's coming along, because this particular signal, it's in DC. It wasn't automatic. You had to wait for somebody to push the button. You could get stranded out there. So let's talk a little bit about this transportation plan problem. Okay. So the question that gets asked, and this is really why we're doing this today, we're getting this and talking a little bit about it, and that is, are transportation plans covered by written notice? What do you think? A general transportation plan? Yes, sometimes, generally no, never, none of the above. If you put none of the above, tell me what you think the answer would be. Some people say yes. I got a yes over in the Q&A. Let's see if it's not showing up. Oh, there we go. There's the responses. Again, hopefully everyone changes default, and I'm still working with it. Sometimes, yes, the classic depends. Sometimes it's dominating. Yeah. And by the way, the answer is actually sometimes, it actually falls between B and C. Again, if it's a transportation plan dealing with design issues, it might vary slightly, okay? But yeah, there's some things that are protected, but only within a certain narrow scope, okay? It has to do with the fact that really written notice deals with maintenance and snow and ice and those kinds of issues. The transportation plans fall into this gray area where people go, well, yeah, but it's a long-term plan. Well, what happens is the plan does put you on notice that you've seen that there's a defect, but additional defects can occur, and someone still needs to put you on notice of specifics. Okay, so it is a sometimes situation, but generally what I would tell people is, if you've got a plan, it's the implementation is where you're going to get yourself in trouble if you don't have an implementation. So let's look at our friend, the one in Chemung County, their local road safety plan. And again, just the specifics of this map that looks at the places with a higher than above average chance of roadway departure. Okay? By having this map, the question is, did this make them more liable or less liable in Chemung County and Elmira? And talk about why, but I'm very firmly in the camp of it actually reduces their liability, with a big if. We'll talk about the if here in just a minute. But it can reduce your liability if you know where the defects are. Yes, you're on notice. There's a higher risk. You'll notice there might be a problem if it's a plan that deals with crosswalk safety, or if it deals with potholes because it's an asset management plan. Yeah, you're on notice. But the liability actually goes down because of qualified immunity. Okay, and so what I want to do is our last little segment we want to talk about is this concept of qualified immunity. The liability that occurs when it comes to anything that we're doing, you can get sued because of negligent or defective highway design. Okay, so what's going to happen is somebody's going down the road and they're going to say the crash occurred or the incident occurred because the agency was negligent, or built the road improperly, or there's a defective design. Okay. Now, if you built it improperly, you probably are going to be liable. But the key is there has to be a negligent or highway design. Okay. Just because you have a plan, that's not design. And we'll talk about this idea of qualified immunity here a little bit more. But before I do, give me some example of negligent design from transportation plans. Okay. And guide rail, by the way, would be an example of something where if you've got guide rail in there and you didn't have enough distance to make the guide rail work, you could actually increase the liability because the plan called for something which actually can't be built. Okay, improper super elevations. Okay, what else? Give me some examples. If you know times when an agency has been threatened with a lawsuit. Okay, roads designed to maximize speeds and throughput simultaneously. Maybe. Actually, I would say if it's an interstate, that's the design of an interstate. It really comes down to levels of risk. ADA issues, if you don't properly take them into account. But there's a lot of myths about ADA. We actually have done webinars where we're doing some training this year on ADA. That's always a fun one to deal with. Do you have to have a minimum slope? Well, sometimes. Site distance issues, bridge replacement plans. I don't know if you've seen in, I think it's Lithuania, where they have a bridge that they failed and the whole thing popped up. It's pretty cool. Search on the internet near Vilnius. Intersection alignment issues. Yeah. Again, what are the plans? What are the things that you're looking at? So look at your transportation plans and make sure they follow through with what are the current standards that they're following with. Okay. And if you've got an old plan that you're using, say you developed a transportation plan before COVID hit, and now you're going back through and you're starting to implement that plan. And we'll talk about the implementation here in just a minute. Great idea, but you don't want to get in a situation where you've created liability because between the time you built the plan and when you actually implement it, the standards have changed. When you go to build it, you need to revisit what are the current standards and build to those current standards. Now, here's a pretty cool thing to keep in mind. If you build something to current standards, okay, say for instance, we'll pull up here as an example. Let's look at a mailbox. So you built something to a mailbox and it met the standards for crashworthiness when it was put up. But the standards changed because we used to test roadside objects with an NCHRP document, National Cooperative Highway Research Program, for those who really care. And now we're supposed to use something called MASH, and it doesn't stand for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. It stands for, of course, I shouldn't have said that because now my brain won't remember what MASH stands for, but safety hardware is the, and manual is the M. I can't remember the A off the top of my head now, confused my own self. Oh well, but it's an AASHTO standard for how we crash test roadside hardware. So if you had built something with the old standard and it gets struck or a crash occurs, you're like, oh man, we're liable. Well, if it was meeting the standards when it was built and you have a reasonable plan to replace it, or it's not so dang old that nobody would have thought you could have replaced it, you're actually okay. That's something called the vintage rule. The vintage rule is still there, still a protection. Doesn't affect transportation plans moving forward, but it can help you in the past. When people go, well, your plan said it this, and that's not the standard today. You can't be held to today's standard when you actually did the work. If you've got good documentation, good records to show you did meet the standard when it was built. And you may want to keep in your library the standards that were available when that occurred, especially if they're not state standards or federal standards and some local standards that you're using. Put it with the item. So the idea behind negligent design is you can use something called the qualified immunity defense. And there's some key factors that are going to occur with negligent design. So I apologize for more text than I like to use, but these are pretty important. So I want to make sure you saw them. Okay, there we go. Manual for assessing safety hardware. Thank you. My brain just couldn't remember it. Okay. The key factors for negligent design. If you're going to be sued and you can get that protection of qualified immunity, the design has to be approved on a rational basis, i.e. get an engineer or an architect, get the right people involved. If you need a planner, get a planner. Don't chintz out. That protects you quite a bit. If not plainly inadequate, you didn't go do something that people would go, that's not reasonable. and you've done proper reviews, you've done proper studies. You might want to even have multiple studies. That really does help. You don't just have one viewpoint. If only one person looks at something and nobody checks it, it's not as good as if you have lots of people who are doing the work. So negligent design is something that will come up in the courts. And so now let's go back and look at the concept of qualified immunity from the standpoint of a transportation plan, okay? Again, qualified immunity comes about because you can show when we did what we did, we chose the best and least dangerous option at the time using current standards, okay? So what that means is that when you were getting ready to do the work or developing your transportation plan, you performed a study of the actual conditions. You actually looked at what's there. You developed a correction plan. That's these transportation plans. So the qualified immunity is still helping you. And here's the key. It's on a reasonable and rational basis, okay? So that protection protects you for something you've built, but it also protects you. And this is the key. One of the things that people think is, oh, but now I'm going to be sued because the plan says I'm supposed to pave this roadway or change the super elevation or put in a crosswalk. And so the plan is going to make me more liable. It's actually backwards because the plan shows your proactiveness. It shows you have a plan in place to fix the problem. Okay? It actually protects you. So going back to our friend, the Shoan County Local Road Safety Plan and the places with higher risk, they now have a list of their higher risk roadways. They have a list of priorities, and they've developed a plan to repair those risks. That plan can be used as part of qualified immunity that says, yes, we have these higher risk places, but we don't have an infinite pot of money. We have a reasonable, rational plan using good quality standards, and we're working and following that plan. And there's the key. The one key, if I had to walk away with any one thing, is you're following. Having a plan that beautiful, looks great, gets put on a shelf and never actually followed doesn't give you the protection you'd like to have. Your protection comes because it said, I've got 40 sections of highway that need to be repaired. I'm working on those using a reasonable and rational basis. And I'm doing the repairs I can do within a reasonable and rational basis for budget. And there's where you're going to get your protection. Okay. Now, I will tell you, you can still be sued. There's nothing I can do to stop that. You're still going to have liability. There's always going to be somebody who could sue you. The key is going to come back to those 4 standards: duty of care, breach of duty, causation, and the actual damages. But it's going to come down to, did you have a reasonable plan? Are you following the plan? Okay. So again, stop, think about, are you following the plan? And then when the plan is being implemented, is it being implemented with current standards? And have you checked to make sure they're current? By the way, can anybody tell me what's wrong with that stop sign, by the way? I saw this in the parking lot of a Chick-fil-A. There's about 4 things wrong with that particular sign. Get your attention, but it doesn't meet the standards. The wrong size in the lettering, the wrong kind of letters, the font's wrong, the background sign makes it look like a square rather than a octagon. And when you looked at it closely, you realized it wasn't really retro-reflective. So at night, luckily it's a parking lot, so it's probably going to be okay. But yeah, you've got to make sure you're following the current standards. Otherwise, you actually increase your liability. So I was trying to do a poll EV and it was fighting me this morning. So I'm going to just have to do this via the Q&A. So in the Q&A, do me a favor. Throw in the Q&A, does the plan change liability? How does the plan change liability? Okay, it kept crashing. I finally had to give up and just say, we're going to just have to do it with the Q&A this morning. So how does a plan change liability? So in the Q&A for me, type in, it documents the process. So yeah, and it documents the process. By documenting the process, you actually reduce your liability. Okay. What else does a plan do for liability? It gives you more awareness. You know, people go, well, but more awareness means I've got more risk. Well, actually, it decreases your risk because you can show you have a plan in place. It shows you are aware, yes, but it also shows that you're trying to make improvements. Okay. Yes, it's going to come down to possibly a jury or a judge looking at the reasonableness of the plan. But if you've got a good plan and you're following it, you've actually decreased your liability. Having no plan, let's just look at the scenario in a different way. Let's just imagine you decide, I'm not going to do a plan because I'm going to make sure nobody can document that I knew about it. And let's say the problem was the thing we've got right over here. Let's go to my next slide. This has been sitting on the side of the road. It's a roadway safety hazard. Okay, it's been there for years. You don't have any kind of plan to replace it because you don't inspect it. You don't look for it. You don't see it. Someone runs off the road and they hit this thing that's been there. It's a landmark. It's so well known, people give directions. You go down past the mailbox that's got the hard hat on it, you turn right. Well, somebody came down, they didn't turn right. They hit the mailbox. Serious injury, maybe even a fatality. What do you think the courts are going to do? Yeah, the courts are going to tell you you're liable. You didn't have a plan to replace it. You should have known about it. There's no protection for you. Okay. So not documenting it is actually backwards. Your protection comes from having good documentation, good plans. Don't let somebody else. I mean, you hear all the time about New York City. People go out, especially attorneys, and they document every single defect and they send it to the city to put them on notice. Hey, what the heck? Turn into a plan. Make a plan to make and repair and upgrade those things. Now you can turn it on its head and say, yep, you're right. We know about these things now. Thank you very much. Saved us some time of inspection. But put together a reasonable plan. If you have no plan, or worse, don't implement the plan, you've got a problem. Now, I do just want to show one slide that's completely outside of liability, but why do we do all of this? Why do we do this? We're doing this because we want to improve safety. We don't want one mistake to cost somebody their life or to have somebody injured so badly that it affects their life for the rest of it. And so the idea of a safe systems approach is we put some redundancy in place. And by having safe roads, by having good emergency management, by working with people with education and training, getting people to slow down, which has become a major issue after COVID, we can reduce redundancy, we can improve safety for everybody, okay? So what I want to do, I'm going to go back to this one we had before. We've already seen a few of these things. I want you to fill in a few more. What are some ways to reduce liability? And let's see, I've got a couple of things in the Q&A. I'll answer why you guys put those in. Are you not liable if it's out of the right of way? Well, you might be liable if it's out of the right of way. It really comes down to whether there was a duty or not, whether it made sense. For instance, if you had a slope and you let a tree grow up on that slope on a road by use, and now someone hits that tree, you may be liable because even though now it's technically out of the right of way, you should have probably removed that tree because it's a safety hazard, okay? And yeah, someone put in there that New York pedestrian lawsuit that occurred in a lot of cases because they had been put on notice and they didn't have a plan to fix the problem, okay? So yeah, so you need to do safety courses, wearing PPE. Now you think that's transportation related? Yeah, that actually is a way to reduce your liability, okay? Record keeping, proper ditching, create and use checklists. People know I hate paperwork, can't stand it. I love forms, however. Checklist can help us not miss something, retire. You know, retiring might reduce your liability, but might not. You're probably protected as an employee working for an agency under the public officers law. So I think that's you'll be okay. Keep working. You're good. Someone asked in the Q&A, can you clarify what is actual notice? How is it different than written or constructive? Actual notice is just a subset of written that essentially, if you're put on notice by certain people or certain organizations, that's considered actual notice. So if you're called up by the sheriff's office, that's considered actual notice. If you're put on notice by the state troopers. That's actual notice. It's just a actual written notice. I put them in together because they really fall into the same sort of category. You'll sometimes see them written one way or the other. Okay. Training, record keeping, document, have a plan. Yeah. Okay. Clear trees. Yeah. But the thing about it is, when we've developed our transportation plans, we're going to be in pretty good shape if we've got a good plan and we followed through with it. But like we all know, and we always have a little bit of fun with this little cartoon here, whenever it decides it wants to play, some days it's just being stubborn. You got to always expect the unexpected. You just never know what's going to happen. And we'll see. You're going to play today for me? It's going to win. Supposed to have the big orca come up and take the guy out. But hey, some days you eat the bear and some days the bear eats you. Oh, here we go. I got it working. Woo! It's totally CGI, by the way. It's completely fake. Obviously, for a lot of reasons. Not the least of which is those sounds are not right. But always expect the unexpected. Always think about when you're developing your plans, how is it going to get implemented? And if you got a good implementation plan, I actually think you'll be fine. But read through it, make sure it's current, and make sure it's being followed. We will be continuing with our foundational webinars on our Tuesdays, so you're welcome to come for those. We've got some coming up that you might be interested in, and you might want to go back and look at the old ones. We have the general highway liability one. And then we do have our spring workshops. This liability class is just one of many that we've got going on around the state. I will look at the last couple of questions in the Q&A and I will let you guys get out of here. We have an interesting case here. An MPO would like to inventory pedestrian facility condition, i.e. the sidewalks. But an improvement plan is not part of the effort. It sounds like it would increase the liability, but for whom? Well, in this particular case, if you've asked to do an inventory, as an MPO, you were asked to do an inventory. You do an inventory just like anything else. You give that to the agencies that want it. They then should turn that around and create a plan. If they don't create a plan, the liability would fall on them. Okay. If somebody doesn't want to do an implementation plan, they actually might increase their liability. And I say might, again, I'm not a lawyer, but what I would tell you is go ahead and do the inventory. Actually, we got to start there anyway. We have bridge inventories, we have road inventories, we have chips inventories. You got to start with an inventory anyway. Do a good job, do a really nice job. And then the agency could then decide, okay, what kind of plan do I want to implement? I would say to the agencies that are asking for it, and you might tell them, hey, look, once you have this, develop a plan. It doesn't have to, we're going to fix every sidewalk in 2 months, but you need to have a plan in place. Otherwise, you might have actually increased your liability because now you are on notice that there are defects out there. Okay. And any other questions? Otherwise, again, I will let you go. And if you want to contact us or get anything from us, we have a very extensive website. You can just search for us. Truth be told, you could type the thing in. You can also just search for NYS LTAP. Okay. Or just send me an email, david.orr@cornell.edu. Would be glad to look at it. And by the way, it looks like I'm doing a longer version of this. Now I got some things I'm going to change and some tweaks. We're going to have a little fun at your MPO conference later on. We're going to have a big whiteboard. We're not going to use PolyV. We can do it in person. And I promise to sling a few coasters at you for those who know me. Thanks, everybody. Have yourself a great day. Stay safe, stay well, and get outside. Looks like a nice day till the rains come about 2 o'clock, at least here in Ithaca. I better write that down. Thank you. Bye-bye.